All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and this is my co host, Matt. We are here with Dr. Kent Hovind for a video dedicated to answering the question, what is the evidence for Noah's flood?
Donny, that is a great question. And as a matter of fact, this is episode 2 of an ongoing series of biblical creation.
That's right, Matt. I'm excited for this. Noah's flood is definitely an important topic. Now, episode 1 focused on the evidence for young earth creation. The third episode, we will be focusing on refuting evolution. I think we'll be dedicating 2 episodes to that. And we want this series, this ongoing series, to be one of those go-to series for those looking for thorough answers to these topics. Kent, as always, it's great to have you, my brother, for this ongoing series. How you doing today?
Hey, doing great, brother. Got to give tours of Dinosaur Adventureland today. Come on down. I love, was it a little chilly, about 68 today? What do you Canadians got up there?
Yeah, we're pretty close to 0 as usual.
Okay. Hey,
okay. Kent, that's great to hear. Brother, you're doing the Lord's work. I appreciate all the tours, all of the work you do, upholding the truth of biblical creation. That's what we believe in here at Standing for Truth Ministry. So, Matt, before Kent gives his presentation, did you want to go over the format or structure for this episode on the Genesis flood?
Yeah. Firstly, Kent is going to be giving a 30-minute presentation on the topic. Then Donny and I will be asking Kent a series of questions related to Noah's flood for about 20 to 30 minutes after that.
Very good. I appreciate it, Matt. Once Dr. Dino is done with his section, Matt and I will stick around to contribute to the topic with some of our own thoughts and also our input. With that being said, Dr. Hovind, the floor is all yours, my brother.
All right. Well, thank you. Brother, I thought about the solution for all of Canada's problems. We will send you our president. You can have him.
I'm not sure that'll be much of a solution, but we can try.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on, brother. My name's Kent Hovind. I've been a Baptist preacher almost 50 years. A couple months, it'll be 50 years. I taught high school science and math for 15 years. And I believe the Bible is true and evolution is stupid. The Bible says in 2 Peter chapter 3, at the end of time, the scoffers would come along who would be willingly ignorant of the creation, the flood, and the coming judgment of God. Noah's flood is critical to explain all the geology we see today. Background to it, if you read Genesis chapter 6, God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually. That's about the same way it is today. Everybody was just evil. Even the thinking was evil. And it repented the Lord that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and creeping thing and fowls of the air, if it repented me that I made them. And the earth was corrupt before God, filled with violence. All flesh had corrupted his way. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. The earth is filled with violence. Through them, behold, I will destroy them with the earth, make thee an ark of gopher wood. So Noah told his boys, gopher wood, we got to build a boat. So why did God use a flood? Where's the evidence for all this? Why not just have all the people die? Well, things to consider about a flood. The flood left evidence where simply a miracle would not leave any evidence that we could find today. The effects are here today for everybody to see. We can be reminded of God's judgment. I live in a gravel pit in Lenox, Alabama. There are 7 layers of gravel that start in Alabama and go to North Carolina, 500 miles of gravel. And the rocks are all rounded off like they've been in a giant rock tumbler, because they were. Noah's flood made all the gravel layers. The moon and the tide is what caused all these layers to form. We covered that when you come take our tour here at Dinosaur Adventureland. By God, people could watch Noah building that boat, and it gave them time to repent. People could have said, Noah, what are you doing? I'm building a boat. Why? God told me it's going to rain and destroy the world. Oh, and then but some of you would think they would think about it. Nobody else got on the boat, though. They could have, okay? Several theories about what caused the flood. I'm going to share the Hovind theory of where the water came from, what it did, and where it went here. I do cover this on my video series. You get a whole seminar series, 18 hours for $50. Video number 6, where I talk about this topic, the flood of Noah. A couple different theories. First, where did all this water come from? You need to understand what the earth was like before it'll make any sense. It says in 2 Peter 3, the scoffers are ignorant of how God made the heavens and how the earth was standing in the water and out of the water. If you look at this cross-section diagram of the earth, the red part would be the hot center of the earth. Then there's the blue part. There was actually water under the crust of the earth. The Bible says he founded the earth upon the seas. Most of what's now in our oceans, it used to be inside the crust of the earth. So the earth today is 70% underwater. It wasn't that way when God made it. Most of that water was inside the earth. Also, I'm a strong believer in what's called the canopy theory. There was a layer of water or ice, a couple inches thick, above the atmosphere, squeezing the atmosphere down into maybe 10 miles. Today, the air that we're breathing stretches out, 50 miles. If you squeezed it down into 10 miles, everybody at the surface would get double the air pressure. And there's overwhelming evidence that animals were gigantic in the past, dinosaurs, for instance. And, an 80-foot dinosaur had nostrils the same size as a horse. How's he going to get enough air? Well, today he couldn't. But before the flood, if they had increased air pressure and increased oxygen concentration, they could breathe just fine. Much bigger creatures could fly because they can't flap fast enough today. The air's too thin. But if the air was thicker under more pressure, everything would fly easier. So we cover a lot more on that in my 2-hour video number 6, but I'll just give you the highlights here. So I think there was water under the crust of the earth, layer of dirt to stand on, maybe 8-10 miles thick, just guessing, and plants and trees, and then a layer of air, maybe 10 miles thick, and then a couple inch thick layer. The Jews have always taught this canopy overhead was crystal, and it was 2 or 3 fingers thick. The whole earth surrounded by a big crystal greenhouse, okay? I cover that on video number 3. So the earth was made with water under the crust of the earth. It says, the earth is the Lord's, he founded it upon the seas. Today, the seas are upon the land. It used to be the land was on top of the sea. He gathered the waters of the sea together. He layeth up the depth in storehouses. Whenever you see the word the deep or the depth in the Bible, it's talking about the oceans or the seas. So it says in Psalm 136, he stretched out the earth above the waters. So I think when God made the world, he created it with water under the crust and water or ice above the air for protection. So why does the earth have so much water compared to other planets? Not only does Earth have a lot of visible water, oceans cover 70% of the surface. Another 10 oceans worth of water may be entombed deep inside. There's still water inside the crust of the earth. Lots of it, more than's on the surface. Okay, Discover.com did that. So in the 600th year of Noah's life, it says, the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. What would that do? Now, the rain was on the earth for 40 days, but that's not where all the flood water came from. Most of it came from inside, okay? He shut up the sea with doors. It brake forth as if it issued out of the womb. When I made the cloud, the garment thereof, and the thick darkness, a swaddling band for it, and break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. Here shall thy proud waves be stayed. I believe at the beginning of the flood, the crust of the earth cracked apart like an eggshell, and it is still cracked apart. There are fault lines all over the place. The San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, the New Madrid Fault. The earth is cracked up like an eggshell. I don't think anybody argues with that. This fault line, some of them are still moving. And it's usually along those lines where we get volcanoes and earthquakes. Nearly all of them are along these fault lines. It's still affecting the world today. So there was water under the crust of the earth. Otherwise, and there still is, otherwise you could not have hot water vents. Hang on one second here. When they went down to the bottom of the ocean, Jacques Cousteau and those guys, they discovered millions, maybe even tens of millions of hot water vents shooting up into the bottom of the ocean. Well, if there's hot water shooting up into the bottom of the ocean, where does it have to be coming from? Down lower than that. There's still water in or under the crust of the earth shooting up into the bottom. So atheists say, wasn't that proof of Pangea? This whole Pangea idea is absolutely stupid. The idea is that all the continents used to fit together. They say, Hovind, do you think the continents used to fit together? Well, the textbooks sure teach it. Look at this one. You can move all the continents together, make a chicken. No. In order to make Africa and South America fit like they do for the textbooks, there it is. Africa and South America seem to be a perfect fit. Yeah, they don't tell you they shrank Africa 40% to make them fit, and they twisted one way and one the other way. People say, do you think the continents were connected? I say, they're still connected right now, underwater. If you took all the water off the planet, you'd notice there's dirt underneath. Okay. Of course, the continents they're still connected. And the fact that they fit, my house and the church would fit perfectly if you slid them together. What does that prove? Absolutely nothing. Okay. So the idea, there's Earth without any water on it. Now, let's see. Where's the shape of the continent? You can't even tell. So the shapes seem to fit. Similar fossils are found on opposite sides. What does that mean? Well, there's similar fossils all over the world. See, they got some fossils found in up near Alaska and in Asia and Africa. That means nothing. It means a worldwide flood. Here's the evidence they use to support this Pangea. They say the shapes of the continent seem to fit, which is a pure coincidence based on the water level. Similar fossils are found on opposite sides of the ocean. Those fossils are found all over. Magnetic reversals. What they don't tell you, they shrank Africa 40% to make them fit, and Mexico and Central America are gone. ¿Qué pasa, señor? ¿Dónde está Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras? Hey, ¿qué pasa? What happened? They just took them out because they didn't fit the pattern. And they twisted Europe and South America one way and Africa the other way. And if you take the water out of the oceans, you will notice there's dirt underneath. The oceans have a floor to them, okay? So they say there's magnetic reversals. This is one of the big things, one of the big lies they teach in the textbooks. There are no magnetic reversals. The Earth's magnetic field cannot reverse. What they measured was stronger and weaker magnetism. I cover this on video number 6 about the magnetic reversals. What happened, I think Walt Brown has it exactly right. They were measuring stronger and weaker magnetism as they came across the ocean floor and found the cracks of the earth of the basalt. During the flood of Noah, the crust of the earth cracked and the water came out, the layer underneath called the basalt would bulge up into that crack, causing it to crack. Water rushes into these cracks, and actually the line ought to go down there. There are no magnetic reversals, it's just stronger, weaker. Earth's magnetic field has declined 10% in the last 150 years. 40% in the last 1,000 years. I agree. Earth's magnetic field's getting weaker. Walt Brown's got the best explanation for that with his Hydroplate Theory. You might want to watch that on YouTube. CreationScience.com has that. So if the crust of the Earth is represented by the two brown, top left corner, the two brown bricks there, and a spring underneath, it would be the water. As the bricks slide further apart, that's going to bulge up in between, like a wrinkle in your carpet. The Earth broke up, and they were measuring stronger and weaker magnetism. The crust of the Earth would slide away from this bulging mantle inside, and as it cracks, the water rushes in, cooling it off. And a hot rock won't store a magnetic field. So they were measuring the cracks in the ocean floor. They were not measuring magnetic reversals. Anyway, I think God used this flood to destroy the whole world. And there's lots of evidence for that. That's what you want me to talk about. I'm trying to get there. I'd say the first and best evidence for Noah's flood would be the scripture. The Bible says it happened. Nothing in the Bible's ever been proven wrong. There's some things that haven't been proven right yet, but they will be. So the Bible says there was a flood. Plus, there are these flood legends in cultures all over the world. Hundreds, I think 250 legends have been found now of people that never heard of the Bible still talk about a time when the world was flooded with water. You can see plates and moving. I don't need all that one. It's true the Earth's crust is still, the cracks are still moving. And South America and Africa are getting further apart. So what does that prove? Well, if I find somebody headed east on I-10 at 70 miles an hour, does that prove they started in Los Angeles 4 days ago? No, they could have just got on the interstate, 10 minutes earlier. The fact that the continents are moving, you can't take that number divided by the distance and come up with any meaning. It means nothing. So they're trying to avoid two problems, okay? The magnetic field's getting weaker, meaning the Earth is less than 25,000 years old. Secondly, there's very little sediment in the bottom of the ocean, very little. If the oceans were millions of years old, there'd be a lot more sediment down there. So they say, well, it's being subducted back into the mantle. It's just a handy way to avoid the problem, okay? No one has produced a logical mechanism how the Earth's magnetic field even can reverse. How you're going to flip over the core of the Earth, make it spin the other way? Right. You better study some physics before you teach that dumb idea, okay? So we talk about the Ice Age. Let me get up to slide number 216 here. When you go to the ocean, you can find seashells and clams all over the place. But usually, as soon as a clam dies, it opens because the muscle relaxes and it opens up and somebody eats it, the crabs or the seagulls or the fish. But on top of Mount Everest, The climbers reaching the top of Mount Everest plant their victory flags over the remains of animals that once lived in the sea. You mean there's seashells on top of Mount Everest? Yeah. There are oysters on top of the mountains in Peru, the Andes Mountains, 2 miles above sea level, 11-foot oysters, 2 miles above sea level. Well, the biggest oyster in the world today is 14 inches. That's the world's record. It's in Denmark at a restaurant. Google it, world's largest oyster. Why do you explain an 11-foot oyster? Well, everything was bigger before the flood came. The Bible says before the flood came, the people lived to be 900 years old. You can get my charts here on our bookstore, drdino.com, our website. Adam was 930. Everybody before the flood's living to be 900 almost. After the flood, that dropped off to 400, and then 200, and then 100, and today hardly anybody makes it to 100. This was just a different world. That canopy overhead protected them from radiation, increased air pressure, perfect diet, perfect climate. You could live anywhere in the world, North Pole, South Pole, even temperature. I believe, I cannot prove, but I believe the Earth was not tilted over 23.5 degrees like it is today. If the pole of axis of the Earth were perpendicular to its orbit around the sun while it spins, everybody would get 12 hours daylight, 12 hours darkness. Today, tilted over, in the summertime we get shorter days. Summertime we get longer days when we're tilted toward the sun, and in the wintertime we get shorter days, and the southern hemisphere gets longer days. So I believe before the flood, everything was bigger. Certainly, clams were bigger. They found 500 giant oysters, fossil oysters, 2 miles above sea level. Biggest one weighed 660 pounds. Well, that's a big oyster. And the clams they find are often closed. Got a pretty good sized one here, a petrified closed clam. Well, how do you explain a petrified closed clam? Clams open as soon as they die. It had to be buried alive and buried fast. Noah's flood buried and made nearly all of the fossils, maybe even all of them. We don't see fossils forming today anywhere. And it's certainly not in any numbers like they find them. The tops of the highest peaks of Mount Everest, possible to find 400 million year old fossils of sea creatures. And shells that were deposited at the bottom of the shallow seas. Now the fossils are exposed at the roof of the world, 25,000 feet. How do you explain marine sediments on top of Mount Everest? Well, first place, Mount Everest is a little ways from the beach, like 450 miles, okay? Clams don't run across, they don't run very well, okay? And when they open as soon as they die. Petrified closed clams are found all over. Sometimes there are beds of them, 20 feet thick. They go for miles and miles. Millions of petrified clams. Petrified eggs, fossilized eggs are found. How did that happen? That's a soft body that has to be buried in soft mud and then fossilized. Fragile items like giant jellyfish are found fossilized. Fossil jellyfish. Walt Brown, in the middle of the desert, they find fossilized whales, 80 fossilized whales in the middle of the desert. They found a bird with a 17-foot wingspan. He couldn't possibly fly today. The air's too thin. But if you had compressed air before the flood, by this canopy overhead, air was thicker, for lack of a better word, bigger creatures could fly. So the Bible says the fountains of the deep were broken up. I believe the earth is spinning now and was spinning then, and that either something hit the earth like a comet, or just the crust of the earth cracking and the water and land trading places, everything being shuffled around would cause the earth to wobble, like when you hit a top with a rock, it'll wobble for a while and then recover, spinning at a new angle. I think what we have now is the recovered angle of spin, and the earth is still wobbling a little bit. The North Pole is moving around. You can Google all that, okay? So the Bible says he stretched out the earth above the waters. So I believe when the crust of the earth broke open, it shot rocks up too along the edge of the crust. Erode them off the edges and blast them up like a missile, and shattered this couple-inch thick canopy overhead. And super cold ice at, say, 400 below zero Fahrenheit, or for you Canadian Celsius folks, probably about minus 220 Celsius, or 50 degrees Kelvin, that would shatter the ice canopy. Outer space beyond that is near absolute zero. So this ice would be really cold, and super cold ice is magnetic. So most of the ice, when it was shattered, that canopy overhead, most of that ice was sucked in and dumped on the North and South Pole. So we had an instant ice age. That's what explains the mammoths that are found frozen, standing up, food still in their mouth, didn't get to swallow their last bite, and they died of suffocation. No water found in the lungs. Frozen, solid, standing up, camels up near the North Pole. How do you explain that? Real simple. Noah's flood destroyed the whole world, so the earth was covered in water, some of it frozen north for the polar caps, some of it liquid, most of the rest, okay? This dump of ice on the earth caused the earth crust to crack, and it released fountains of the deep. And the spreading ice caused the ice age effects. There's no question the glaciers and avalanches came all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. There was an ice age, no question. When? I think it was at the beginning of the flood. And the flood waters lapped up against the ice. The earth was covered in water, some frozen, some liquid. And the crust of the earth cracked up and is still cracked today. The fountains of the deep broke open. Water went shooting out, causing all the effects we see and this water, by the way, this sliding the plates away a little bit is going to cause the wrinkling of the layers. When you look at these layers under the magnifying glass, which I've done many places, I've traveled with the layers of the earth, and they're bent. There's no fracture marks in there. They were all soft and all bent together, and then they hardened. If you bend a stack of pancakes that are still soft, they won't fracture internally. If you wait till they're hard and try to bend them, they're all going to crack. These are all bent while they're soft. All the layers are the same age. Fountains of the deep broke open, and there's still water shooting up. That would kill microscopic creatures in the ocean, like diatoms, little bitty glass-bodied creatures. Diatomaceous earth. Let's see. Diatoms are unicellular organisms covered with a cell wall containing silica, belong to an algae group. Let's see. Diatomaceous earth is found in huge layers, diatom. Derived from the Greek di means across, and tomb that means cut across. Let's see. Diatoms occur in hundreds of different shapes. Their size range from 10 millionths to 150 millionths of a meter. Diatomaceous ooze at the bottom of the ocean is formed by the sedimentation of dead diatoms. So these creatures die, they fall to the bottom, and there are tens of thousands of different kinds of diatoms, and they are beautiful. Anybody that thinks diatoms, which are super microscopic, happen by chance from an explosion of nothing, needs to have their head examined right away. Don't drive on the highway. Don't handle anything sharp. You've got a serious mental problem if you think diatoms or anything happen by chance. Diatoms today accumulate slowly at the bottom of the ocean. It would take about 1,000 years to get an inch-thick layer of diatoms. But you can go to any hardware store and buy diatomaceous earth, swimming pool filters. It's used for detergents, fertilizer, insulation, soundproofing, paper finish, bricks, paint thickeners, oil dry, cat litter, diatomaceous earth. Now, nearly all insects, maybe all, I'll say many all, or nearly all, they breathe through their skin. They don't have lungs like we do. They breathe through spiracles, abdominal spiracles, okay? So they breathe through these holes. Here they are. Diatoms will plug those spiracles. They're so tiny. If you sprinkle diatomaceous earth around your house, it'll kill all the insects. They suck it up into their little spiracles, and it kills them. They suffocate. Well, the largest diatomaceous earth quarry in the world is in Lompoc, California. I went down there one time and talked to some of the guys that work there. Said, guys, tell me about your Lompoc, your diatomaceous earth quarry, Sea Light Corporation. Well, here's a mountain made of trillions of diatoms. They've been mining it, cutting it back, leaving that cliff exposed. Diatomaceous earth goes for over 100 miles and is hundreds of feet thick. And you want to tell me this slowly accumulated over millions of years? I think what happened is when the fountains of the deep broke open, the hot water came out and killed all the diatoms, and they snowed to the bottom and made huge piles of dead diatoms. Lompoc, California. While they're digging through this, there they found a fossil of a skeleton of a whale, along with trillions of fish fossils. The whale was standing on end and is about 80 feet long. Now, the layers are also tilted. So the fact that, the layers of diatoms are tilted, the 80 feet was not the number to work, but just the thickness of the whale. Let's say he's 12 feet thick. You had to get 12 feet of diatoms to accumulate before the whale could rot. I think maybe there was some kind of catastrophe. I went down there, took some of the slabs of diatoms. I mean, it busted open with a Swiss Army knife. And inside, you'll find millions of fossils, fish caught between these layers. Now, how do you explain billions of fish fossils packed in diatomaceous earth? Noah's flood. Very rapid change in temperature of the water would kill all these diatoms, and they simply snowed to the bottom. Samples of what's possibly soft tissue discovered in a fossil in the Jurassic period. By the way, there's no such thing as a Jurassic period. There's no such thing as a geologic column. Read about diatomaceous earth. Trillions and trillions of little tiny microscopic creatures, all different shapes. Here's a collage of the different diatoms. Gorgeous. I think maybe it was designed. There are billions of fossils are found in this diatomaceous earth. You can buy it. Red Lake earth, diatomaceous earth. Fossil shell flour, diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth food grade, you can eat it. Okay? Swanson diatomaceous earth. This all had to happen, I think, because of Noah's flood. How to use this plant, how to use this stuff on different plants, cactuses and things. National Fossil Day, 10 million year old fossils in diatomaceous earth. Let's see. They celebrate the 10 million year old stickleback fish fossils. Right. They're dreaming, okay? Billions of these fossils are found worldwide, very well preserved. We got some here in our museum. Come see them. Fish in diatomaceous earth. We used to sell copies of this. I don't have time to do that anymore. The chalk cliffs of Dover would be the same thing. Cretia is the Latin word for chalk. So they talk about the Cretaceous age. That is pure baloney. There is no Cretaceous age, okay? There's so much chalk, evolutionists call this the Cretaceous age. The chalk cliffs of Dover, what, 150 feet thick? Pure chalk? Again, similar to diatoms. This happened because of the flood. The Bible says the waters prevailed upon the earth and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. So during the first few months of the flood, the dead animals settled out. They were buried. The swirling waters of the tide going up and down, the swirling motion, would tend to collect these dead bodies into piles. What happens today? The ocean's spinning around, little eddies. It forms piles of junk in different areas. They sink to the bottom, and you tend to find a lot of creatures piled together. Exactly what we find. You get these little glass sand art toys and flip them over. They'll make a whole bunch of layers in a few minutes. I cover on my channel tonight. Let's see, what's this, the 11th or 10th? January something or other. What's the date? 10th, okay. On the channel about the layers of the earth all formed in one big flood. It's called hydrologic sorting. The moving water sideways is what did it. See, the moon causes the tide on the earth. And if the moon was holding the tide up there, a big bulge called the high tide, while we spin, if the earth were covered in water in Noah's flood, the water would be about 1.5 miles deep, 8,800 feet, which means to keep the bump under the moon, the water from the east is always being sucked in at the same speed the earth's turning the other way. The North Pole, the earth is turning 0 miles an hour, but at the equator, 1,037.6, depending on your altitude. If the water's going sideways at 1,000 miles an hour, that's going to make layers. The layers that we see in the earth were not formed vertically, they were formed horizontally. And that whole geologic column is stupid. The layers form sideways as the water flows. You might form 10 layers at a time. So you can get a fossil up on top that's actually older than a fossil deposited at the bottom. There's no such thing as a geologic column. Underwater landslides and turbidity currents would do enormous damage. Underwater, with the water sliding back and forth. Well, in 1929, the transatlantic cable was cut by an underwater landslide going 70 miles an hour that covered 40,000 square miles. That's almost as big as Alabama. Underwater landslide off the coast of Nova Scotia destroyed the cable. And the swirling of the waters around during the flood would explain why the fossils are sometimes found twisted, contorted positions as they're buried. In Wyoming, they found a fossil graveyard back in 1934. They said the concentration of fossils was remarkable. They were piled in like logs in a log jam. Sometimes they find fossils in the swimming position. These are hoofed animals, not fish not meant for the water like that. And they're swimming with their head up, trying to get one last breath. All died in that position. Robert Bloom, South African paleontologist, said there are 800,000 million, 800 billion skeletons in the Karoo Formation in South Africa. That's a lot of animals. So if there was a flood of Noah, I don't think we would find animals evenly distributed. We find pockets like this from the swirling waters. We would find fossilized all kinds of things, itty bitty bugs, diatoms, and big ones found fossilized. 1878, they found a skeleton, concentration of iguanodon skeletons in a Belgian coal mine. One of the skeletons, let's see, this cluster of skeletons goes through 100 feet of solid rock. There in California, they find petrified redwood trees. Canadian Geographic did an article on that. What's the date? Back in '99, about fossilized redwood trees. Redwood trees don't grow up there. How do you get fossil Axel Island? That's way up here. Axel Island, northern Canada, redwood tree stumps. Come on, guys, explain what happened here. Baptist, our Bible view is, hey, the world was different before the flood. Anyway, Donny, I could go all day on the flood, but I think the evidence is overwhelming. There was a flood. There are fossils everywhere. They're not fossils forming today. Noah's flood probably made them all. The layers of the earth that we see were all formed, I believe, or nearly all of them, by the sideways moving of the water back and forth. Noah's riding the tide up and down, but it's sucking water in and out of that tidal bump, making all these layers in hours, not millions of years. Okay, is that enough, or you want a whole lot more, or what?
That's great, Kent. That's about 30 minutes, and we've got a bunch of questions for you. So we'll still be enjoying those visuals and slides that you have for us. And so I'll start off with a couple questions that I have based on your presentation. As always, Kent, great presentation. I'm curious as to your thoughts on, as you know, there are various flood models in the creationist world. Some flood models or some creationists would propose that the pre-flood world was essentially a supercontinent, not necessarily Pangea, but all the land was in one place. And at the flood, the supercontinent would have broken up into all the various plates that we see today. Mm-hmm. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. Is that what your model would propose, or how would the pre-flood continent look according to you, Kent?
Well, no, that model assumes that the Earth still had to have a lot of big oceans like it does today. What they're doing with that crazy, I think that's crazy, that model. They're saying, well, the Earth today is 70% underwater, so it's always been 70% underwater. So let's just move all the continents together. No, the shape of the continent is a pure coincidence based on the water level. It means nothing. If you raise or lower the oceans a few hundred feet, everything changes. If you lowered the ocean just, 100 feet, you could walk from France to England. English Channel would dry up. Between Alaska and Russia, it's about 60 feet deep in most places, the Bering Strait. So I cover that in much more detail on video 6, but I don't believe that model at all. I think the shape of the continent is a pure coincidence based on the water level. And so they're still trying, I think, they're stuck with the idea that the Earth, that all this water that's in the oceans now had to be there before the flood. The Bible says in Psalm 104, he formed the earth to be inhabited. God made the world to be inhabited. Today, only about 3 or 4% of it is habitable. The rest is underwater or ice caps or mountains or desert, 10% desert, 10% ice caps. So I think they're stuck trying to accommodate something that does not need to be accommodated. The shapes of the continents is pure coincidence based on the water level after the flood. So I think most of the water was inside the crust, just like the Bible says, like I shared tonight. Okay, Go ahead.
Ken, that's a great answer. And you've shown throughout your presentation that a lot of water is underneath the crust. A lot of water. And so that would have come forth during the flood from the fountains of the great deep. Ken, is that right?
Right. Most of the water for the flood came from inside. The Bible says it rained for 40 days, but the water kept coming up for 150 days. Well, then it's not all coming from rain. Two things are happening. Water underneath the crust is escaping to the surface. That's one. Two, because of that, the surface is collapsing, raising the water even more. So you got those two things going on. They're trading places. The land and the water are trading places. The concentrating the mass, rock is heavier than water. So by letting the crust of the earth sink down while the water comes to the surface, that's going to shrink the mass of the earth a little bit and speed it up. Like an ice skater, when they're spinning fast, they tuck their arms tight, they spin faster. Took your arms out, you slow down. So the earth, I think, sped up a little bit at the time of the flood, explaining maybe why we have 365 days in a year, and they probably used to have 360. It's slowing down now, the earth is, but it was going faster originally. Okay?
Yes, that's good. So the oceans that we see today, these large bodies of water, they would not have existed in the pre-flood world. As you pointed out, the earth was created to be inhabited. And so it would have been 90% green, most likely.
And I think it was all fresh water during the flood. And some animals have had to adapt to the salt water. We know the oceans are getting saltier every day. Mineral salts, every time it rains, it washes off the mountains, running over these rocks, picks up salt, and deposits in the ocean. Evaporation takes out just the water. So it's a giant distillation pond, and the oceans are getting saltier. The oceans today are 3.6% salt. I believe at the flood, they were all fresh water. And since then, some animals have had to learn to live with the salt water. They've adapted to it. We now have freshwater bass and saltwater bass. And they might have had a common ancestor called a bass. It doesn't prove they're related to a giraffe. Okay. So,
or a strawberry.
Some couldn't adapt and they died. But it's been a gradual change. See, adaptation to your environment is not evolution. It's still it's still a fish, still a bass. There's saltwater crocodiles and freshwater crocodiles. They could have had a common ancestor, crocodile. That's not evolution. Okay.
Amen. It's based on the pre-existing ability to adapt to those new environments. And so would the pre-flood world then, Dr. Hovind, have had enough water to account for some of these giant creatures that we see, like Megalodon, Basilosaurus? They would have existed in the pre-flood world from your model?
Right. Everything lived to be, if you look at the age of the people, 900 years for Adam, 930, well, reptiles never stopped growing. Never. We've got a picture down here at a part of our tour of the world's biggest tortoise at 5 foot. Our tortoise is probably, Billy, measure that thing sometime. It's probably 2.5 or 3 foot.
Yeah, right.
Okay. We call him Turbo. It's a joke. Okay. But 5 foot tortoise, they find fossils at Yale University. They've got a fossil tortoise. I got a picture of me standing next to it. It's 12 foot. Well, there's no turtles that big on Earth now. How do you explain a 12-foot turtle? Well, this was before the flood, when things were living longer. I think the reptiles, which never stopped growing in the pre-flood world, would get to be, 60, 70 feet long. This is the age of dinosaurs with Adam and Eve, not millions of years ago. There is no such thing as millions of years ago. No such thing.
Very good. So the next question I have, and then Matt will hand it to you for one of our prepared questions that we have on the topic. You mentioned the canopy model, the ice canopy model. I've seen, I guess there's one major objection I'd be curious as to your thoughts on, Kent. It's been argued by those opposed to the various canopy models that there would have been one or more heat problems because apparently the canopy would have created a greenhouse effect. Firstly, have you heard this? And secondly, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it certainly would. That's nice and warm in a greenhouse. I mean, they have greenhouses all over the world. We got 2 up here at Dinosaur Adventureland. Okay, I mean, nothing can live in a greenhouse. As far as the canopy, if there was a canopy of ice around above the Earth, maybe 10 miles up, the moon and its gravitational pull creates the tides. It would also pull the canopy up and down, causing a constant breeze to be going. As it turns, today we know that moon's gravity also pulls up the crust of the Earth. All of Canada probably goes up 2 inches as it passes under the moon. So there's a crustal tide, and the ocean tide goes up, 5, 6, 7 feet more in some places. But the crust goes up and down. The canopy would have done the same thing. It would have been a constant changing of the. It's like if you live in a big inflatable building and somebody keeps pushing on the roof, it's going to keep the air moving inside. So I don't know. That would be it's a minor problem compared to everything coming from a dot of nothing exploding. And then they talk about the problem with rain for 40 days. It would heat up the world, called the latent heat of condensation. I agree. When it rains, it releases heat. But when the air expands, if the canopy shattered, the air expanding out would neutralize that, because expanding air lowers the temperature. Get a can of hairspray and hold the button down, or a can of paint. It'll get cold in your hand because you're releasing the pressure. So I don't know all the solutions to that one, but I think that the Bible's clear. There was water above the atmosphere. So what do they do with that?
And that's a good point you made about the expansion would have a balancing effect or canceling out effect of a lot of this heat. It's good. Matt, question from you, brother?
It is very strange that they would complain about raining for 40 days and 40 nights when they, in their model, in the evolutionary model, they believe it rained for 40 million years straight.
Yeah.
Google it. 40 million years it rained. Anyway, for the next question, what about the Caribbean islands? Can the global flood model explain the existence of these islands? And are these Caribbean islands pre or post flood?
Well, I think if you raised or lowered the ocean level, everything would change. If you lowered the ocean level just a couple hundred feet, all the islands would be connected. Everything in the world's connected. The ocean's average 12,000 feet deep, average around the world. But like between Vietnam and Australia, that whole channel there, you can Google continental shelf. You'll see it. It's very shallow. So I don't see a problem. Who's got a problem with the Caribbean islands? It's a place where it sticks up through the water. But if you walk out off the coast of the Caribbean islands into the beach, you'll find you're still walking on dirt. You can walk out probably forever. You could probably walk to America if you had long legs. There's dirt under the ocean.
Right, that's a good response, Kat. Okay, so the next question I would have involves I'd like to ask this question. So a lot of old Earth creationists, Kat, and you've answered this in a great way in the past. And so they'll argue against a global flood. A lot of older Earth creationists, they believe in a local flood, by pointing to the existence of coal, oil, and natural gas. If I remember correctly, Eugenie Scott, in your informal debate with her, I think she brought this up. And so essentially they assert that there's no way that we as young Earth creationists can account for all of this coal, all of the oil and natural gas in just 4,500 years. And I'm curious what you believe is a good response to that.
Well, I come from Illinois. There are a lot of coal mines. I've talked to many people that work in coal mines. I got a lot of friends that work there. Put my slides back up, really. Okay. Strip mines, they have coal seams 200 feet thick. Coal mine in Wyoming, monster coal mine, sometimes 200 or 300 feet of solid coal. Giant trucks to carry it away. That's big. Billy, how'd you like to change tires on that thing? Yeah. Here's a guy in the bucket where they pick up the coal. And sometimes in the coal, they find human artifacts. Mr. Newton Anderson found this bell inside a lump of coal. Well, it's got some kind of Egyptian deity or something on it. I think that the coal formed because of the flood. So Jeannie Scott said, if you took every blade of grass and plant and flower and tree in the world today and pressed it into coal, which they can do in 20 minutes, there's so much coal down there, you couldn't make it all with all the plants in the world. Well, that's because, you can take it down, brother. That's because she's stuck with the uniformitarian idea that what we see is what Adam and Eve saw. Today, the world is 70% underwater. There's no trees growing there. A whole lot of it's desert, no trees there. 10% more is ice caps. So I don't know what percentage. Can you Google that, Billy? What percentage of the world is forested? I'm going to guess it's around 10% or so of the world is forested. So if you had more area to be forested, i.e. more land and less ocean, and you had much bigger trees, because everything was different back then. Everything lived longer. The trees would be huge. So I think there was incredible vegetation when the flood came that could then be packed into these layers. And these layers would be formed. There's an iron pot found inside a lump of coal. The sole of a shoe found inside a lump of coal. So I've got a lot of stuff on that on video number 6 of my series about the coal form. I think the coal formed because of all the trees that were buried at the time of the flood? Is there a given answer? What percent is forested?
31.
31%?
Yeah.
Of the,
As of 2024.
not 31% of the world, 31% of the land, which
Land mass.
of the land mass.
Yeah.
So you'd want,
4.06 billion hectares.
so you want 31% of
Land mass.
of 29%.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was pretty close to that. About 10% of the world is forested, if you count the whole surface. So I think the Bible says the scoffers are ignorant of what the earth used to be like, the creation, and they're ignorant of the flood. That flood destroyed a world that was very different than what you and I see. Okay.
Well said, Kent. I find it funny because I see the critics, they'll argue, as you know, again, that there would be just too much heat, too much energy produced during the flood. But from my understanding, in labs, simply through heat, pressure, and energy, they've rapidly formed in real time coal, oil, and natural gas.
Right.
And so a lot of the heat produced during the flood could be utilized, correct me if I'm wrong, to rapidly produce coal, oil, and natural gas.
Right. And then yet they think all of this heat that they're complaining about was in a dot smaller than an atom. Don't they? That's one
everything.
hot dot. That's a hot dot. All the stars' energy was in that dot. That is, you tell them I said sweetly in Christian love, that's stupid. Real stupid.
That's the real heat problem, Kat.
Yeah.
Matt, question from you, brother?
Yeah. How about when it comes to modern erosion rates? Do they support an old Earth paradigm, or are they just too fast?
Well, we're putting up a display now at Dinosaur Adventureland about the erosion rate of Niagara Falls. It took me a while to find the slides on that, but Niagara Falls is eroding about 4.7 feet a year. Well, it's only moved about 7 miles from where it started. You do the math, Niagara Falls is less than 10,000 years old. Now, if the flood made all these layers, and the Niagara Falls started, or Niagara River started flowing after the flood, it'd be cutting through softer material. It would take hundreds of years for that to harden into the current rock that it is. Same thing with all the erosion rates we see. If the earth suffered a great flood, like the Bible says, you got layers of mud everywhere, it's going to dry out from the top down. So the top 10 feet is going to dry and make a hard crust, trapping the moisture, and it's going to take longer. The drying rate will change the deeper you go. I'll just pick a number for the concept. Okay, you can do the find exact details later. But let's suppose after Noah's flood, in the first couple of years, actually probably in the first 5 months, the first 4 or 5 feet dried out. Noah can get out, all the animals can get out, walk around, plant your garden, start living. Then that drying of the crust would take hundreds of years. There may be places where it's still not dried out from Noah's flood, 500 feet down. So I think that once the erosion cuts through that crust and hits the soft stuff, well, then, Katie barred the door. It's going to really erode fast. So like Grand Canyon, obviously, if you filled up Grand Canyon today, a big lake would fill up behind it called Grand Lake. If that started going over the top and cut through, once it gets through that crust, depending when this happened, if that happened in the first, 50 years after Noah's flood, once it cuts through that hard crust, it hits the soft stuff, whoosh, Grand Canyon probably formed in a week or a month, not millions of years.
Very good. Ken, I'm curious. You like to ask, and I think it's a great question, and I think the critics fail every time to answer it. Where do these new layers come from, if deep time evolution is true? I have heard them argue or put forth many answers. One of them has to do with lava from volcanoes, right? The volcanoes erupt, and then the lava cools and forms new rocks. Is this, in your opinion, a good answer to that question, Kent?
Well, there are 3 types of rock, generally 3 classes of rock. There's sedimentary, from just mud settling out, okay? Then there's igneous, from the word ignite. It's been burned, like lava or ash, volcanic ash. Then there's metamorphic. Metamorphic means change. So if you take the sedimentary rock and change it by heat and pressure to another kind, you now have metamorphic rock. So most of the crust of the earth, I believe, is sedimentary rock. The lava shooting out of volcanoes and the ash clouds settling down, they make metamorphic rock, no question. But the layers that they're showing us in this stupid geologic column are nearly all sedimentary. So that's not correct to say that it's, lava, these layers are coming from lava or from, That's crazy. I keep asking them, Where's all the new material coming from? Outer space. They're telling the kids in this textbook that the Proterozoic era at the bottom is 2.5 billion years old. But the top, the Holocene, is only 10,000. Well, where was all the dirt for the Holocene hanging around for nearly 2.5 billion years? They never answer. Have you ever heard them answer it, Donny? I ask them every debate. Where's this? There's no geologic column.
Right.
It's fixed.
They'll point to one or two areas in the world, like the Grand Canyon, perhaps, where they argue, oh, you know, all the layers that are represented in the textbook are found here in these 2 or 3 selected areas. What are your thoughts on that, Kent?
All the layers in the Grand Canyon probably formed in 1 year. See, if the moon was pulling the water up on the earth, making a bump called the high tide, while the earth is turning under it, Noah would be floating up and down in the tide. He would not even feel that, okay? You would have if the earth were covered in water, you would have what's called a harmonic tide. The tide could go up and down 200 feet every 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes. Well, if the water came up 200 feet, the water has to be rushing in from the sides. And it's the sideways movement of the water that makes all the layers. You can do it with a sand art toy from Walmart. It makes layers in a hurry. It doesn't take millions of years. So this one's easier to see, black and white. But these layers don't take millions of years. It's every tide would make 5 or 6 layers. If you watch the video, Experiments in Stratification, some French guy did it back in the 50s or 60s. It's excellent, though, in Colorado, that he did this, showing how that all the layers form sideways, not vertically. They form horizontally. So this geologic column does not exist anywhere in the world. And it's sad that they teach that to the kids. There's no such thing as a Jurassic period.
We had young Earth creationist geologist John Mackay from Australia. He was on the channel. He gave a presentation on the results from their flume experiments over in Australia, and they've shown and verified exactly what you're saying, Kent, that these layers, including limestone, can be formed rapidly. And you pointed out in your presentation that you can basically get a fossil on the top that turns out to be older than a fossil on the bottom.
Right. That video, Experiments in Stratification, shows that very clearly. If you have 8 or 10 layers forming simultaneously sideways, they show it happening. All the water's moving sideways, and 6 or 8 or 10 layers form at the same time. So you might get a fossil deposited here, and then 10 minutes later, get one deposited at the bottom down here. But this one is older than that one. Right. The layers do not determine the age of the fossils at all. It's all baloney.
Well said.
I have a question then. If the worldwide flood was catastrophic, how is it able to preserve things that are so delicate, such as raindrops or small footprints or dinosaur eggs, without destroying them?
Fair question. We'd have to watch the video when we get to heaven, but I don't think it was instantaneous catastrophic everywhere. There are probably right now storms going on in the world someplace, maybe typhoons or hurricanes. Doesn't affect me in Lenox, Alabama. So it could have been localized areas where you get catastrophic events happening and 500 miles away, perfectly calm. In order to flood the world, the crust of the earth would be flexing up and down. There might have been some places covered in water, and then a couple of weeks later, they rise back up, and now they're out of the water. And the creatures that are frantically trying to stay on high ground, flying around trying to find someplace to survive, they would run over there real quick, fly over there, float over there, land on the high ground for a while, leave their footprints behind, and then that area sinks under. So I think the crust of the earth flexing up and down would say some places exposed and then submerged, exposed and submerged. And it probably took 3 or 4 months to kill everybody in that flood. Noah was in the ark for a year.
Right.
Okay?
And that's one of their major objections too. And it's rather weak. I mean, as you've put it, we know that the crust of the earth would be flexing up and down during the flood. You'd have parts of the earth that are uncovered for a few weeks, maybe a few months. And so during those periods, you could have certain dinosaurs laying eggs, and then eventually the flood levels rise and buries them and preserving them. Not really an issue for the flood.
Right. And quite frequently, dinosaur footprints are found all going the same direction, like they're trying to avoid the rising waters.
Hmm. So I've heard in your debates, Cap, and again, they just don't answer your challenges on the geologic column. I've heard them argue. I'm curious as to your thoughts. Okay, well, all of the atoms are the same age. All of the atoms that make up you, me, Matt, same age. But we would not say that we are relatively the same age, as in I'm 34 years old, Matt is so on and so forth. And so they try to apply that to the geologic column. Maybe the atoms are all the same, but the layers could be different ages, 300 million years old, 500 million years old, in the same way that we're different ages. Kent, I'm curious, what would be a good response to that?
Well, I'd like to see some evidence of that. I always show them an example. If I shuffle a deck of cards, is the top card younger? Moving it from here to here does not change the age of it. All the atoms in our bodies are the same age, I agree. And every speck of dirt on the planet is the same age. Whether it's 6,000 or 6 trillion, it's all the same age. So moving it from here to here, when it gets deposited, does that change the age of the dirt? If they're carbon dating or potassium argon or rubidium strontium or uranium lead dating this material, how did moving it change the age of that? The material is still the same age. So they actually date the fossils by the layer they come from. It's called circular reasoning. I can show you right here. I got it someplace. Circular reasoning. I just worked on my slides to redo the power. I had too many hyperlinks. Circular reasoning. Maybe it's back here. I'll have to become more familiar with it. But yeah, they date the fossils by the layers they come from. Here it is, circular reasoning. They date the layers by the fossils and the fossils by the layers. These layers exist and they're all nice and flat in many cases. Don't you think there'd be some erosion marks in between if that layer sat there for millions of years?
Right.
And don't you think some soil would build up? Soil builds up everywhere, just about everywhere. So it says, this guy said, the intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply. Circular reasoning. They're arguing in a circle. The age of the rocks is determined by the organisms they contain. So here we go. The succession of organisms is determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms. They date the rocks by the fossils and date the fossils by the rocks. Ever since William Smith, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks. Apart from modern examples, which are archaeology, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay being used to date fossils. Radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. This guy said, paleontologists cannot operate this way. There's no way simply to look at a fossil and say how old it is unless you know the age of the rocks it comes from. Niles Eldridge. This poses a problem. If we date the rocks by the fossils, how can we then turn around and talk about patterns of evolutionary change through time? This guy said, the rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. This is called real stupid in my humble, totally unbiased opinion, okay? The charge of circular reasoning can be handled several ways. You can ignore it, you can deny it, or you can admit it, or you can avoid it by pragmatic reasoning. That's what they usually do, change the subject. It's based on circular reasoning. Our authorities maintaining that evolution is documented by geology, and geology is documented by evolution. Isn't this circular reasoning? Yes, it is. It's dumb, real dumb. Okay?
I agree. One last question for you, my brother, as we just hit the hour mark. Time flies by with you. Great answers. And you've essentially answered this question, but feel free to elaborate. Is there evidence for long ages between each geologic layer? You answered briefly here by pointing to the lack of erosion, the lack of evidence for these environmental conditions that you'd expect over millions of years of geologic history. Kent, go ahead.
Right. I mean, if a layer sits there for a while, it's going to build up soil. There should be vegetation. There should be erosion marks in that layer. They should not all be stacked neatly like a stack of pancakes. There should be some erosion between. But no, the thousands of feet sometimes of these layers are all stacked up neatly, no erosion marks in between, no soil buildup. It's crazy. The layers all formed with probably each different tide. Those layers might be 6 hours and 12 minutes different in age. as the tide goes up and down, the water's rushing in and out. And it's a sideways movement of the water that forms all the layers. We'll cover that on the video experiments and stratification. I've covered that on several of my videos I've done on Genesis Baptist Church channel.
Okay, Kent, very good. Excellent first hour here. Matt and I will stick around and provide some of our thoughts and feedback and spend a little time debunking the local flood theory as well. And so, Kent, my brother, I appreciate you giving us an hour of your time. Excellent presentation. Great answers to these important questions. Did you have any final words, final thoughts for the audience?
In 2 Peter chapter 3 in the Bible, it says the scoffers are ignorant of the creation. They don't know what it was like, the canopy and the water under the crust. And they're ignorant of the flood, because that flood represents the judgment of God. And I think people that they're taught all this junk in public school to not believe the Bible, they need to stop and rethink that. God not only made the world, he owns it. He makes the rules. We have broken his rules. We're guilty. And we got to be punished or find somebody to take our place. That's what Jesus did. If you'd like, he'll be glad to pay for your sins. But you got to ask him to forgive you and come live in your heart and save you. I did that almost 55 years ago. Said, Lord, I'm a sinner, but I believe you died for me. Would you please come in my heart and save me? And he did, and things began to change. So you're going to die one day. Here's an example. See, 669, Alt DV, 669, there. Here's a fish swallowing another fish, fossilized in the act of eating. It had to be rapid. Judgment's coming rapidly. It's appointed unto man once to die. After this, the judgment. I'd like to tell people, where are you going when you die? You're going to die, and you're going to be dead for a really long time. Okay, you ought to pack a lunch for that trip. Where are you going? If you don't know for sure you're going to heaven, call me. 855-BIG-DINO, extension 3. Take calls all day long. I'll be glad to lead you to the Lord over the phone. Or go to our YouTube channel, Genesis Baptist Church, and one of the videos on there at the beginning is how to go to heaven. That's the most important thing, I think, everybody ought to be thinking about.
Amen. It's about winning souls. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life. He that winneth souls is wise. So, Kent, I appreciate those final words. Nothing better than leading someone to the Lord. So, Kent, we will let you get out of here. Excellent work, as always. God bless you, brother.
All right. Thank you, brother.
Okay. Bye. All right, Matt, just you and I think that was an excellent first hour to episode 2 of this ongoing series. I got to say, I am pumped for the completion of this series. And what I mean by that is I'm just really excited to get it out into DVD as we want to, as we'd like to. And so we have a lot to discuss over the next hour. I'm going to go over one basic line of evidence that I believe is extremely powerful for the flood. Then we're going to get into a little bit more of our technical work here that we've put in for this topic. Okay. And so I'll hand it to you, Matt, right when I'm done with this. And right here, I encourage the audience, go on Google, just write folded rock layers. And you're going to find dozens and dozens of images very similar to this. And so basically, if you were strong enough, let's say, to bend a rock, well, you'd actually break it rather than be able to bend it or fold it in the same way that we see here, okay? It wouldn't bend like we see in these folded layers. And yet we find these dramatically folded masses of rock layers, Matt, all over the entire planet. And the Genesis flood best explains these folded rock layers. Because these rock layers, they couldn't have been hard when they were folded or formed. These layers were still soft, as expected during a year-long worldwide flood. Okay, so they were still soft as they were laid down by water, which means they would not have had time to harden, which could result in the folding or bent nature of them. Okay, and so all of this points to catastrophism. I mean, we find sedimentary rock layers that extend over entire continents and beyond. Okay, so you can't, as the old Earth creationists look to, Because a lot of them, they'll admit, okay, well, yeah, the earth was once completely underwater, but during multiple times in Earth's history. And so many local floods. No, that doesn't work, because the evidence that we have is worldwide. It's catastrophism, because these sedimentary rock layers, as I just said, they're extending beyond entire continents. That means they're global in extent, which means the cause of these layers have to be what, Matt? They have to be global in extent. It's very simple. It's very easy. The most parsimonious explanation for these folded rock layers, the sedimentary rock strata that are oftentimes in pancakes, just layer upon layer upon layer. Just think of your cheat day where you've got, a stack of 12 pancakes. It's just pancake, 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 very thin layers. That's what we see. They had to have been laid down rapidly and catastrophically. Not to mention the fact that we've got billions to trillions of fossils in these layers. Fossils that are on these continents that are far from the sea, okay? And notice the amazing preservation of these fossils. Fossils of fish being eaten, fish giving birth. Okay, and so my question is, why are there trillions of dead plants and animals buried all over the earth in these sedimentary rock strata? And so that's just one basic line of evidence that I think is an easy one to understand, an easy one to convey, but just really powerful testimony to the Genesis flood, my brother Matt. So let me hand it over to you. What are your thoughts on the initial presentation and the topic? And then feel free to present a few of the things that you've been working on.
Yeah, the presentation went good. He made a great point about, if these layers are going to be millions of years that we're seeing, and there should be soil there, and soil has living organisms in them, and those organisms live in the soil. They move around, and when we see that in the fossils, in the fossil record anywhere, we would expect to see each of these layers that are representing millions of years have bioturbation, which is these organisms moving around the side of them. And these layers are flat and don't have that in them. They should be all over, everywhere, every layer you look. But like you said, if they were moved around, which every layer on Earth is sedimentary, what does sedimentary mean? It means laid down by water. So how could we have local floods laying down globally sedimentary layers that need water to deposit them? Then you made an interesting statement that I had never considered before. If these layers are underneath the water and they are now wet and soft and like clay, well, wouldn't that drastically mitigate heat that would come from friction of hard rock moving over hard rock? If it's clay against clay, something else is very different now, because that would generate a lot less heat because it would be soft. Picture that in your mind, clay touching clay. Now you have a lot less viscosity. The less viscosity you have, the less heat you generate. And when rock heats up, it expands, creating lower viscosity. And if it's clay, you have a double compounding thing now where a lot less heat would be generated normally. So that's what crossed my mind when you said that.
Well, that brings me then, and I know you have some visuals. I'm not sure which ones you want to show and when, but that brings me to the question of the heat problem. Matt, what do we do with the heat during this worldwide catastrophic event? We got plates moving at meters per second movement through the floodwaters, if one holds to that model. We've got massive worldwide volcanism found to the great deep breaking forth. We got a lot of energy. We got a lot of heat. If one holds to accelerated nuclear decay, we've discussed in our videos, there's various flood models: hydroplate, catastrophic plate tectonics, vertical plate tectonics. Some hold to accelerated decay, others don't. And so if you do hold to accelerated decay, that means there's even more heat and radiation on top of the heat and radiation produced during the other catastrophic processes. And so how do we deal with this, Matt? In your opinion, what's the best way to deal with this?
It comes down to the flood models. Kent doesn't hold to the catastrophic plate tectonic model. So therefore, the three forms of heat that are generated, I shared screen if you would be able to show that so people can see.
I'm not sure if you clicked.
Oh,
so if you
sorry, 1 second.
Once it highlights blue, you'll be good. You'll be able to share it.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Take your time, brother.
So as you can see, this is catastrophic plate tectonics. The accelerated nuclear decay is the first form of heat. The second one is catastrophic plate tectonics, which is the subduction of these plates moving rapidly over time. And 3 would be bombardment from space, which is from meteor impacts. Now, Kent doesn't hold to that model. And he holds to hydroplate theory, which only has one heat problem, and we can get to that in a minute. But when we're looking at the catastrophic plate tectonics, you'll notice that the heat mostly is generated from something called accelerated energy. And this accelerated nuclear decay comes from the reason that they believe when you're looking inside of a rock that has radioactive elements inside of it, they find uranium and thorium, and then lots of daughter isotopes that come from these. So by finding the high amounts of these daughter isotopes, like from uranium, it will decay into, right here, we have helium. But argon will come from potassium. So how come we have so much argon and so much helium? They said, well, the only way we can explain that we have so much uranium and so much thorium and so much potassium, but also so many of the daughter elements, is that accelerated nuclear decay must be the only explanation that we have for that to be there, because it's the only thing that explains why there's so much of it and why it appears that the Earth is so young. I have another answer that doesn't require accelerated nuclear decay, and that is by simply going to the observable evidence that we have at the Proton 21 laboratories in Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, because it's in Ukraine, this laboratory is no longer functioning. They, as you would imagine, they're in a war-torn country now. So all of their experiments and everything that they've been working on is probably moved to somewhere else. I just do not know where that is. But what they've done is in their laboratories, they have a high-powered source of energy like lightning, and it's called Z-pinch. And when they run these experiments, they are able to generate all the radioactive elements and regular elements that exist on Earth, as you can tell here, in the same proportion that they are on Earth today. So that got me thinking, like, well, what if we look at other elements? Well, we find lots of iron in the exact ratio that they are in today. But wait a minute, if they're in the same proportions that they are in today, shouldn't they exist as they were billions of years ago, if that's how they were created and how they actually naturally form? What are they doing in the proportions that they are today? So it got me thinking, like, well, let's look at the, not the parent isotope, but the daughter isotope. And we'll notice that the blue is the natural, but the laboratory produced extra amounts of daughter isotopes every single time, and massive amounts of them. So that got the scientists that were working on this thinking, like, oh, wow, there could be some good money in this. And they were right. They sell medical equipment that come from producing these daughter elements in high proportions. So that's how they make their money. So that got me thinking, like, wait a minute, I wonder if we can take these and look at potassium or any of the dating methods that we have. Unfortunately, their information that they give on uranium is not available for the public, probably because they make nuclear weapons from uranium. So the next best thing would be to go to the zircon crystals and say, well, what do the proportions and ratios show in these? Because they can trap them while they're growing in the earlier states. So when the laboratories started to experiment, they were saying, well, let's find out what these radioactive elements form, and then we can see if their daughter and parent isotopes are as they are today. And sure enough, when we look over here, we find aluminum, which is a really high, has a really fast half-life, much faster than potassium or uranium. It has a half-life of 717,000 years. So this is really good because we're able to now test this in the real world and say, what would happen if we were to look at the daughter isotopes that come from uranium that decay into magnesium isotopes? Why are there so many of there should be so much more of the daughter element that would have decayed into if hundreds of millions or billions of years have actually passed? Instead, we don't find that. And the reason we don't find that is because that amount of time has not passed. So the proportion and the ratios that these experiments formed answer the question of why there's so much helium and argon inside of these crystals. And the reason is because these decay rapidly, some in minutes, weeks, months, and years, as opposed to hundreds of millions of years. So that explains why there is so much uranium, but also so many daughter isotopes, and we don't need to invoke accelerated nuclear decay. It just doesn't need to be even considered, because there's no reason to consider it, because the laboratory experiments answer this a lot better than just assuming what evolution assumes. The ratio, right? They're assuming this. And matter of fact, they even make outright statements saying that these are assumptions that we're considering. And these assumptions can be ignored because these are all a hypothesis. And by just assuming these initial ratios, we've assumed the past and we assume the future. And we're assuming that the dates that they give are accurate. Well, we can now say, well, why not just look at the observable evidence from these studies, and they will give us the exact answer. And the answer is they do not form as they would have existed billions of years ago. They exist as they are today. So how could it possibly be true that even a million years has gone by when the evidence shows us by looking over here at the aluminum isotopes that form, that they're not even over 717,000 years old. And they're exactly in the same proportions as they are in nature. So when the experiment formed them, it formed exactly what we see in nature today, not as it would have been billions of years ago. So I would say that's a case closed thing. But the problem is evolution, they take this and they calibrate everything because they believe in uniformitarianism. So when you look at ice core layers, when you look at seafloor sediment spreading, when you look at magnetic reversals, they take into account all of these things are true because of radiometric dating, and they cross-link them. But again, that becomes a problem. They even state that the general perception is that there's competition to get the oldest dates, and there's kudos in it, because if you can get an older date from something, you're probably going to get more grant money. When we look on the sea floor and we say, oh, look at the spreading, it takes millions of years to do this. Matter of fact, one of the oldest is on the right-hand side. It's 280 million years, but that's only up in this region right here. And it's not very many places. But why? How come this doesn't say 6,000 years? Well, that's because, again, we're starting with an assumption. And if we're going to look at seafloor spreading, we also have to take other things into consideration. And that is when the lava flow comes out and it goes into the deeper depths, the pressure changes the date. Also, the temperature changes the date. So the deeper it goes, the colder it gets. And you can't accurately test these things. They admit this now in studies. They say, be careful. You can't apply these dates and expect to get anything accurate from doing it. So if they admit that, begrudgingly, I'm sure, they have to say there's no possible way we can be completely honest and say that these are accurate dates. These are completely true. So that would take us back to, again, the geologic column, what we were on today. But before I go on, do you have anything you would like to talk about? Or
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a couple questions on that, because I think that's fascinating. So if they were formed exactly as we see today, in the same ratios, if I'm correct, is that right?
Right.
What would the pre-flood world have looked like then in terms of these elements? Did God create the earth with radioactive elements, or are these coming about during the flood because of these processes?
Great question. I would say that God did create these things. And unlike hydroplate theory, Walt Brown believes that they were all formed during the flood. But you have got to remember that plants need nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, right? You need potassium in the ground. Well, potassium is a radioactive element. And so take a banana, for example. If you get a bunch of bananas and you go through the airport, the meter's going to go off saying that there's radiation. You can't take bananas through an airport thing without it going off. So there's lots of radiation there. But the reason it doesn't damage us is because our kidneys will filter out any excess that's not supposed to be there. So people have made in this idea that, oh, this radiation is extremely bad. There's no way God would have made it. It would have damaged everything. It's well, no. The planet probably is running itself and rotating because of these things. The soil needs them for plants to grow, and we know the pre-flood world was full of plants. So I think the idea that there was no potassium is just kind of strange. And I don't see any problem with there being radioactive elements on Earth, in Earth. I think they work naturally with the environment and everything else. I don't see them being a problem whatsoever. They serve a function or have a purpose.
So basically, to provide the soil in the pre-flood world immediately after creation with the adequate nutrients, energy, heat for plants to grow and to create healthy ecosystems, you would require radioactive elements, as in there's a function, and they're not necessarily bad as many people erroneously assume, Matt.
Right, exactly. A lot of people would never say like, oh, I can't eat the banana because there's radioactive potassium in it, or I shouldn't have strontium because it's radioactive. It's like, well, they're actually very beneficial for your system to have these things. So you need them. The soil needs them. The plants need them. The fruits need them to grow. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. So I would say that there's no issue at all invoking that God created these things, and that's why we find them on Earth today. They didn't have to be formed at the flood, because that just invokes another heat problem that doesn't need to even exist.
Right. And a lot of flood geologists and flood researchers that hold to global flood models that necessitate accelerated decay, would you argue that they have unnecessarily created a heat problem that many of them argue there is no solution for other than a supernatural explanation?
Correct. This observable evidence that we see in a laboratory resolves the heat problem in nearly every model. And Walt Brown created his own heat problem by invoking that God must have done this during Noah's flood. If he had literally put this at the time of creation, there would be no heat problem in his model either.
So in your opinion, is that because he's assuming radioactivity of any kind is negative?
No, his yes, that is his initial reaction in his mind about why it couldn't have been there. But his heat problem is from the generation of these elements being created during the flood, which generates massive amounts of heat.
Okay. So if we get rid of that assumption, that those basic presuppositions that radioactivity of any kind is bad, then we don't necessarily have to go into our flood research assuming that accelerated decay must have occurred.
Exactly. Yeah, they're exactly. Accelerated nuclear decay can be invoked for a little bit, but there's no possible way you can force billions of years into a single year without catastrophic implications.
Would you invoke some kind of accelerated decay in local circumstances, such as the Oklo reactor?
Yeah, that would make much more sense because that was a specific area. It was isolated. It couldn't have naturally started based on the uranium that was in there. The plates above it are very thin, so it doesn't seem like it would have been a natural reactor that would have turned on its own. There would have been something that could have turned it on, and it could have accelerated the decay, stripping all of the uranium until it was depleted.
Okay, so we don't have an issue with the Oklo reactor, as many militant critics of young Earth creation have proposed.
No, because an accelerated nuclear decay over 1,000 to 2,000 years isn't the same. And we're only removing a few thousand years, by the way, tens of thousands of years. We're not trying to invoke 2 billion years crammed into 1 year. We're removing a couple 100,000 years over the period of 1,000 years, because it went on and off multiple times. So
yeah, and I think that's why your work here in this book, Radioactive Decay, is so important, because you touch on the Oklo reactor. There's not a whole lot in creationist literature dealing with that specific point. And you go into why we don't necessarily have to hold to flood models that have accelerated decay, because the ripple effect of that is a lot of heat and a lot of radiation.
exactly, all to answer why there's so much helium and argon. So
Right.
the critics look inside these zircon crystals and they find so many daughter helium isotopes. They said the only possible way that those can be there, based on what we know about the past, is that uranium must have decayed into that. That's what they have to start with. The observable evidence now tells us, there's actually lots of it created rapidly when it forms, and the zircon crystals trap that. And then after they trap it, it's got music. Oh, so much for that video. Okay, so these zircon crystals, they trap it, and they get a glimpse of the past. But while this is occurring and it's locking these things in there, these daughter elements are ticking away very, very quickly, and they're becoming helium and they're becoming argon rapidly. And then, so that shouldn't be there if millions of years have passed. So they're true. But the problem is their other assumption that it must have happened through accelerated decay can now be removed. There's no reason to invoke it. So we solved their problem.
Right. Okay. So the helium being present in these zircon crystals are still a massive problem for the old Earth model. Because if these crystals really were 1 billion or more years old, most of that helium should have slipped out, since helium is a very slippery molecule. But if these crystals only go back thousands of years, then yes, most of that helium should still be present. Most of it is present when we analyze these zircon crystals. But you're saying we don't require accelerated decay to explain why there's so much helium.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
perfect.
So I guess my question then would be, according to your specific flood model, and this is why I love what we do and how we allow a platform for creationists who may have differing flood models, different approaches, right? This is good peer review, as one could say. And I think you have excellent answers here. And so I guess I would be curious as to your thoughts on the radio halos. Does the existence of these radio halos in rocks, these microscopic areas of damage that are basically found within the rocks themselves, that suggests there's been a lot of decay and rapid decay, do you believe that accelerated decay is necessary to explain those?
No, because we find a lot of them in the Grand Canyon, and we find a lot of them in uplift areas. Matter of fact, there's places called overthrust where we can find younger rock below older rock. And the reason why is because the overthrust took that layer that was below it and threw it on top of the younger rock that was above it. And in doing so, it added more of these plutonium halos. So it seems as though they can form from friction or from movement. And we can't know when or how they formed. There's a lot of questions when it comes to those, but they can seem to form through movements of these things. So if we have massive catastrophic plate tectonics going, you're going to find a lot of those, rather than invoking accelerated nuclear decay. They can form literally from plate tectonics.
Okay, so basically friction and these catastrophic geological processes that happen during the flood could create these scars, these radio halos, basically.
Yes, exactly. And we find them in the Oklo reactor as well, actually. So
okay, that's that's interesting. So if we were to argue that the Grand Canyon was rapidly formed, as
right.
like we've had Mike Ord on, who presents a good model for the Grand Canyon, Professor David McQueen, Dr. Ken Hovind, right? And so whether the Grand Canyon was formed due to a series of lakes in the post-flood period that had basically breached and carved the canyon rapidly, or Mike Ord proposes, and we got a presentation from him on the channel, that the Grand Canyon was being formed by receding floodwaters, channelizing and carving out the Grand Canyon during the flood. You're still going to have the necessary factors to produce radio halos.
Absolutely. And because we can look inside of the Grand Canyon and see that there's not river rock everywhere on the different layers. So if a slow river was slowly creating this channel, then we would say, okay, it looks like there's millions of years that have passed. So let's check and see if there's any of those radio halos in the things, or the plutonium halos, and find out, like, can they occur naturally from uniformitarianism? But instead, it seems that they form in catastrophic environments like the Grand Canyon and in these over-thrust areas.
So I've understood that basically when it comes to these radio halos, and Dr. Andrew Snelling, he's pointed to the Los Alamos, where they have drilled a deep hole, and they notice the further you go down, you go through granite, where you can see these halos, right? They're observed. There's many of them. But as you go down deeper and deeper, the in situ temperature, it increases, gets hotter. And when you get to about 150 degrees Celsius, what happens is these radio halos fade away. They completely disappear because the heat has energized the crystal to the point where the particles of the crystalline structure, they've actually repaired itself. And so would that be a line of evidence for, firstly, radio halos not requiring the accelerated decay, as you pointed out, but again, why there's not this massive heat problem the evolutionary community looks to, because then we shouldn't find any of these radio halos, because they should have just been wiped away from all of this heat, since heat gets rid of that evidence anyways. Matt, any thoughts on that?
Again, it goes to, again, also granite, right? If granite is heated to a really high degree, it becomes rhyolite, and rhyolite never becomes granite again. So if the planet was so hot that it did turn into rhyolite, why is there still granite? Why is the basement rock still granite? So I think it's a better answer that they were almost like wet clay, and they formed, and as they formed mountains, we can see that they formed like wet clay would, and this would explain much more of a reason why when they hardened and there was other plate tectonics, it answers so much more than just the conventional model on what we're seeing, because they have to account for why a solid rock would bend. And they would, again, have to invoke, well, maybe it was in a local flood, or maybe it was really, really quickly, like when they say, what are the mountain ranges that are off the Himalayan mountain range? They believe that happened quickly now, right? So they're coming along, but it's just taken them a while. And I would imagine that if we go there, we would also find lots of radio halos in that region, because it's a catastrophic region, of probably the largest we can find on Earth.
Very good. Matt, you did a fantastic job answering my questions on that particular issue. So if you did have some more visuals or arguments you wanted to go through, go ahead.
Sure. A lot of people have radiometric dating in their mind, and I did have a little presentation to give, where we're going to answer that right now. Why does Africa seem to have the oldest fossils on it? Well, what you're seeing is a little chart that shows you that by looking at these radioactive elements on the bottom over here, you can see uranium, and why it would sink to the bottom is right here. It's one of the highest in the atomic mass and weight. And then the lightest are at the top, potassium, argon. And so during the global flood, if everything's being mixed around, where do you expect that these radioactive elements are going to be in the different layers? Well, we would expect the heaviest and most dense to be on the bottom. They just happen to date the oldest. And then the lighter ones are near the top. So this is all fine and dandy, but now what happens when we look on Earth? Well, I found this awesome chart And it shows you where the Precambrian older rocks are exposed on the earth. And then the younger rocks would be in the white. They're the average. So the Precambrian would be really old rock. And now we're going to look at the African continent and where they found some of these skulls and why they're dated as they are. So we're going to see the ranges are all the way from 120,000 up to 600,000. So I took this map that I showed you earlier and I overlaid it with this one, and you'll notice something very interesting. The oldest bones are on the exposed area of the Precambrian rock. So I'll zoom in here so you can see it even better. And looks like that's the largest I can make it. You will notice something very interesting. These people could have all been living at exactly the same time, but we wouldn't know because they died in different regions. So when you take for example, here's a good one. Okay, so here's me. I chose this cave to live in, and I'm going to live there till I die, and I don't want anybody to touch me. Okay, Kent is on Dinosaur Adventureland, and he says, "I like this dinosaur. This is my pet Loch Ness monster, and I want to be buried on the other side of that lake over there and left alone with my Loch Ness monster. I want to die there." Okay, so he gets buried on his property. I get buried inside this cave. And then 500,000 years from now, somebody comes along and they find our bones. Who's older? How are they going to date this? Are they going to date our bones? No, they're going to date the rocks that we were found in. So by doing that, who's older now? Well, it's going to look like actually I'm older than Kent because he was buried over here in this field. I was buried in Precambrian granite rock. So they're going to assume I'm older. In reality, Kent was born before me. He's out older and we're alive at the same time. But I'm going to date thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years older than Kent. So again, we have to take that in consideration, especially when we're looking at Africa, because as you can tell, a lot of it, sorry, wrong one. A lot of it is Precambrian rock that's exposed. And then when we look at this list of Homo sapiens, we can find like Neanderthal, Hydroplate, habilis. They all are in this region, which ironically enough is the most exposed regions for Precambrian rock. So wouldn't it make the most sense why they're dating so old, even though they're not? They're on exposed rock that's ancient. So that to me makes the most sense. And then when we look at humans and we look at primates, we notice something interesting. The primates got off the ark. They inhabited Africa much earlier. Humans traveled together. They went to the Tower of Babel. So, we're talking 1,000 years later. Then they migrated and finally went into Africa. So there should be pretty obvious why we find primates in lower layers than we do human beings. Now, a lot of people say, but the layers, where did those layers even come from? Like, why are there layers even on top of things? Where do these layers come from? Well, remember, we explain the layers from the global flood. There's no doubt, but we also explain layers from the Ice Age melt-off. Remember, after the flood, the water levels were lower, and Kent says that explains how animals migrated. They traveled to regions like Australia, and then the Ice Age ice melted, the glaciers melted, the water levels rose 300 to 500 feet, and now they became landlocked. But when you look at Africa, you notice there's a desert right here. Now, the secular people say, oh, well, that's actually because about 56 to 66 million years ago, there was an ocean that flowed through it. And this is what happened is it killed a lot of the topsoil and led to desertification. But here's what's interesting. If you look closely now, you'll see that the water only runs from north down to south, dumping back into the ocean again. But when we look at Africa from Google Earth, we can actually see with our own eyes, the water is actually moving the opposite direction. It's not going straight south. It's moving off the continent. And it's all over the place, by the way. This is just a nice visual side by side, so you can see what they're telling us is very, very different. Now, I don't say that didn't happen. I'm just saying that this seaway was right after the flood and during the Ice Age, when Sahara was fully green. Then there was the Ice Age melt-off, and that melt-off raised the ocean levels, and it rushed over northern Africa. And we're going to look into that, and I'm going to show you why. And we have salt everywhere to prove it. So now Africa has massive salt mines because of this, by the way. When we look over here and we zoom in right off the coast, this is all salt. And this is mined actually for salt. If you look more northeast, we actually come across what looks like a meteor impact, but it's actually an underground volcano called a Mar. And again, we find salt on the lowest levels of it. Salt. Again, we go to another lower level in Africa. We find a massive salt area right here. Then we zoom back. We can find another massive 10 square miles of salt again in another region more to the east. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There's a volcano that's there. And this volcano is dated at 12,400 years, plus or minus 400. When we look at that volcano on a map, we can see it right here. But you'll notice something. You see these right here? You know what those are? Those are water marks. And that's from water moving over sand. And we get ripple marks. You'll notice that that volcano has lava that flowed out, but the ripple marks moved over it. Wait a minute. I thought they said the last time there was ever water there was about 60 million years ago. But the volcano is stated at being 12,400. Interesting. I think we're getting a little bit closer now to figuring out what's going on. So we look at the ripples again, right up to the volcano. But look at this. The water goes right from that volcano down, depositing more salt. Where does salt come from? Comes from the ocean, and then goes off the continent again over here. And then look, there's the volcano. Look at the ripple. The water went right by it and left all the ripple marks as the water rushed by. So then we go back and we look over here and we go, oh, look, another simulation said that the Sahara went from lush and populated to a desert wasteland about 4,500 years ago up to 8,000. So what's going on here? We have the largest desert on Earth, about 4,000 years old. We have the Sahara turned green and lush about 4,000 years ago. So what's going on? We have the secular camp saying, no, that didn't happen. This was just a sea about 60 million years ago that flowed through it and killed it. Then we have a volcano that about 12,400 years ago that they said happened much, much later. But yet we have evidence that proves that's not true because water is going over the lava flow. That can't be. I say, let's look at it for what it is. It was a major water that rushed over the entire thing, bringing the ocean water with it and all of its salt. And you can see it from Google Earth. It ripped over the entire continent coming from the sea. And as it brought the salt with it, it killed it. And that's what killed all the topsoil. That's why nothing grows there. And it looks like this because when you zoom in, that's exactly what it is. They're ripple marks from water moving over it. And no matter how you look at it, you can see the sand dumping into the ocean because that is runoff, my friend. That's what you're looking at. And the reason why none of their dates work is because nothing matches. What are you going to go by? Are you going to go by them telling you it was 60 million years old? Are you going to tell them that the volcano was true? Because if you look at the other evidence, none of it matches up. Nothing what they're telling you matches. The only thing that makes sense is that our model explains it because it's a catastrophe. It's catastrophic events. They're not looking at it catastrophically. They're looking at it very minuscule, slow, uniformitarianism view when the reality is it's so simple to explain. Just step back, remove everything from your mind and say, what makes the most sense? I can see the sand moving into the ocean still to this day. How could that have happened 60 million years ago? It would be gone. It would be erased from time. Even the subduction slowly would have removed that evidence. Then there's a volcano that they said happened 12,000 years ago. Well, if that happened 12,000 years ago, it surely didn't flood after that because they said that nothing happened after that. So what is the water doing massively rushing over the volcano lava flow? Clearly, it happened more recently. So logic tells us that it was a much more recent event and much more catastrophic than they want us to believe it was. And the dates that they're making up don't agree with one another because they're not true. So That was what I wanted to go over with you guys right now.
Boom. Right there is an epic mic drop, brother. Excellent job. Great presentation. Can't wait for this content to go out to as many people as possible. So with less than 15 minutes left till the 2-hour mark, let me go over some of my thoughts and arguments that I have put together, brother, rather than bombarding you with another series of questions on that, like I did with the heat issue. But what I wanted to do, and what you and I both want to do, is be comprehensive. And I think within this 2-hour show, this is probably one of the most comprehensive or thorough videos that anyone's going to find on this issue, especially as we've even taken time to go over the various flood models. And so let me share screen, and I will go over a few points here on the ordering of the fossil record, and then we'll wrap it up at the 2-hour mark, Matt. And so let me share screen, and if I go over 10 minutes, give me a heads up, okay, brother?
Okay.
Just so I can make sure I don't go over time here. So first thing I want to point out, though, check out this video to the audience. Let's really dig dinosaurs. John Mackay, Joseph Hubbard, two working geologists. Joe Hubbard's getting his PhD currently. And at the 35-minute mark, I'm not going to play the full 5 minutes, but I want people to check it out, because when it comes to the ordering of the fossil record, the so-called ordering of the fossil record, John Mackay, who's got years and years and years of experience in the field, and Joe Hubbard, who has lots of experience as well, they talk about how the ordering of the fossil record, as portrayed in the textbooks, as portrayed by apologists of evolution, it's not nearly as neat and organized as they want to assert or pretend. And in this video, specifically this clip starting at the 35-minute mark, they talk about how when they're out in the real world and they're actually working in the field, what they find is generally a mixed environment. No matter where they look, they find sea creatures, clams, mixed with dinosaurs, mixed with crocodiles, just mixed environments. Okay? It's kind of a jumbled mess. And so I want people to check that out, because I think it's important to see an answer from two working geologists in the field that have actually looked for themselves, and they have pointed out that we're looking at mixed environments. They've also done experiments, these experiments that show rock layers forming rapidly. Okay, so if you go to their research here, they've been on our channel. We've hosted them over 20 times, I believe, and we've had a conference on flood boundaries with them. And they have gone over the strata machine and all of the results, including observing these layers forming rapidly. Okay, we've even seen limestone. The critics try and say, oh, the young Earth creationist model can't explain the rapid formation of limestone. Well, they've seen, John Mackay talks about how they've seen limestone form rapidly in these strata machines. They've seen in their fossil tank deposit, Matt, where they show that the tree is basically standing upright, and the calcium carbonate, it falls out of the solution, and then you can literally see crystal calcium carbonate forming on the spot. Okay, so it doesn't take millions of years to form these layers. Here's a couple images from their flume experiments. And so you can imagine massive flumes all over the earth during this global flood event. Because notice here, millions of years, right, Matt, is what it looks like. But in 20 minutes, this is what they formed in their strata machines, which looks nearly identical to what they portray as millions of years. Okay, and so you can see these layers forming rapidly right before your eyes. So no, it doesn't take a lot of time. Okay, now when it comes to the so-called ordering in the fossil record, again, I've pointed out that we find mixed environments. Okay, John Mackay, Joe Hubbard talk about this. But at the same time, we would expect there to be some order within the mixed environments. And what I mean by that is we'd have pre-flood communities, right? Not everybody is living together, right? It doesn't make sense that humans and dinosaurs are basically living together, okay? And so what we find in the fossil record a lot of the times are pre-flood communities. They're being pulled up and they're being thrust over the continents where they are being deposited for us to find. That's why we find marine fossils in landlocked areas, Matt, that are far from the sea. Generally, we see marine organisms, right? Then we see a mixture of marine and terrestrial organisms. As a matter of fact, we oftentimes find the footprints of the terrestrial organisms, like tetrapods, in the rock strata before we find the actual organisms themselves. You find the footprints, and then later on, we find the fossils of the organisms themselves telling us that they're running from the floodwaters. And then eventually we see mostly terrestrial, but we see marine organisms all throughout the rock strata. And so these communities that are living side by side during the pre-flood world, they would be stacked vertically. Okay. And so essentially what you could do is look at your vertical sediments in the so-called geologic column, turn it horizontally. So rather than looking at it vertically, tip it on its side and observe it horizontally. And now what you're going to find are communities, not communities over time, right? Fish, amphibian, reptiles, mammals, but communities living at the same time, but in different areas. The Bible says in Genesis that a river flows out of Eden, right, Matt? Rivers flow downhill. And so we'd expect different elevations in the pre-flood world, which would be reflected somewhat in the fossil record within the mixed environments that we find anyways. And so we got communities. We got the Cambrian community, the Ordovician community, the Mississippian community. Now, even these names have built-in presuppositions. And that's why I really want people to watch that presentation, but also other presentations with John Mackay and Joe Hubbard, where they go into the origins of the geologic column and the assumptions behind it. Okay. So anyways, we would find community after community. These communities that existed in the pre-flood world, they are buried, okay, in the rock strata because of the floodwaters. And they're living together at the same time. It's not evolution over time. It's just these communities that are being buried sequentially. Okay. And so that's what I recommend is people look at that column horizontally rather than vertically, but understand that when you actually go into the field, yeah, you find mixed environments. I also wanted to, let's see how much time we have, because, so here's the flume experiments. Okay. I got enough time to cover some of these ridiculous arguments when it comes to the local flood. Okay, Kent talked about 2 Peter 3 at the end of his presentation. And 2 Peter 3 says in the last days, scoffers, they are going to deny three things: the creation, the flood, right? The world that then was being overflowed with water perished, and the coming judgment by fire. Nobody would say that the creation was this localized creation. No, it was a universal creation, the heavens and the earth, everything in it, time, space, matter. The coming judgment by fire, nobody with good hermeneutics and theology and eschatology and soteriology would say that, well, the coming judgment by fire is just a localized judgment coming to a city near you. No, it's coming to an earth near you. Okay, Jesus is coming back universally, judgment by fire on the entire earth, judgment on the entire universe, as a matter of fact. So why would we say that the middle event, the flood that the critics deny, the scoffers deny, is not universal, okay, universe-wide, like the first, like the creation event and also the coming judgment by fire? No, they're all universal. The coming judgment by fire is universe-wide. The creation event was universe-wide, and so is the flood. The world that then was, referring back to the entirety of the pre-flood world, was overflowed. It perished. Okay, and another thing, why build an ark the size of a just massive Titanic sized ship, basically the size of an ocean liner. Take 2 of every air breathing land animal, including birds, for a local flood that you knew was coming. All you have to do is move. Okay. You have 100 years to basically move. Birds, we've talked about, Matt, how there are certain birds that basically migrate every single year from Alaska to Hawaii. There's no land in between. They take no breaks. They travel all of this distance in their migration. That's 3,000 miles that these birds travel. Okay. So you don't need to bring birds onto the ark. If it's just a local flood, they can easily move. We know that today. We understand that they take these non-stop trips without any breaks. So there would be no point. Also, in terms of the flood account, what we find is universal language, like you can see on this slide. So technically speaking, there is in the underlying Hebrew, you have what's called the double use of the word kol. Okay. And this is used in the flood narrative, where you notice that the Bible says what? All of the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. This is God's way of saying that everything, literally everything, was flooded. The entire planet was covered in water. Okay. All the high mountains under all the heavens, kol and kol. So this speaks to the universal nature of the flood, not just a local flood.
10 minutes.
And that is completely clear. And okay, I think I'll wrap it up there then, because Matt, you and I could talk all day as to why clearly the flood, according to science and also according to the Bible, is global in nature. There's no way around it. So as we come close to our 2-hour mark, this is still just a snapshot of the overall evidence scripturally and scientifically for a global flood. One thing that we didn't really touch on, but I'd like to touch on quickly, is if you have these geological processes during the flood, these rapid processes, we would expect to find a lot of evidence for that. We've gone over plenty of lines of evidence for that. But recently we discovered what's called these massive slabs of cool rock down within the earth where they should have melted or at least warmed up, okay, to the surrounding material if they were taken down there millions of years ago. But the fact that they've not warmed up, the fact that they have the same density as the top rock, okay, they've looked at this through seismic tomography, tells us that they basically have not changed much in temperature. And so, yeah, 4,500 years ago, you could have rapid plate subduction. Plates are being pushed down. And in 4,500 years, we wouldn't expect those to have melted. And so in the last 2 hours, we've touched on a number of, I would say, fantastic lines of evidence for the global flood, Matt. You've done an excellent job in refuting the critics' best objections, like the heat problem. And Kent, as always, did a great job with his presentation and answering our questions. So Matt, my brother, did you have as much fun as me? And any final words, final thoughts in our last minute here, my brother?
Yeah, I always have fun with these. I'm up days before this getting ready, so I hope everyone likes it. And final thoughts? Yeah, I've always thought it very peculiar that God would give a rainbow as a promise to never locally flood any place on Earth again. Oh, wait, that happens all the time. He gave us a rainbow to not flood the entire Earth again. That's why it's a global flood.
And we could talk about that all day. So, all right, that wraps up episode 2 of our ongoing series here. Episode 1 was what is the evidence for young Earth creation? This is episode or session 2. You could say seminar 2. What is the evidence for Noah's flood? And we wanted to make this, guys, we wanted to make this comprehensive for you, and also limit it to 2 hours. And so we're basically at the 2-hour mark. So we're going to wrap it up here. Lots of information for everybody to digest. And the goal when this entire series is done is to put it out in DVD format. Okay. God bless everybody. Thank you for watching. Matt and Donny are out.